The Democrats who are making these accusations, are they taking responsibility for the buildings burned in Minneapolis or in Seattle or Portland? Anyone who believes that there are any Republicans or the president who thinks that was a good idea, I don't know where they're getting their ideas.
One can buy a lethal weapon, whether they've been found by a court to be a danger to themselves or others. You just might want to know.
About a wedge issue, because the sponsor of the amendment wants to create divisions in the military. The military knows that diversity of our soldiers is actually a strength.
Congressional concerns over DoD. Congressional concerns surrounding the recent Department of Defense directive have intensified as more lawmakers became aware of its potentially alarming implications. The directive, linked to the Biden-Harris administration, has ignited a firestorm of debate over whether it grants excessive power to federal agencies, particularly in authorizing lethal force and intelligence gathering against American civilians during times of unrest. The language of the directive has left many questioning the extent to which it could be applied in future instances of civil disorder, sparking fears about civil liberties and the role of the military in domestic affairs. The involvement of Congress came after watchdog groups and concerned citizens flagged the directive, prompting lawmakers to take a closer look at its contents. Leading the charge is Representative Andy Harris, a Republican from Maryland, who has been vocal about the need for transparency and accountability regarding the directive's scope. Harris, along with other members of Congress, is seeking a comprehensive review of the directive's provisions, especially those that could potentially infringe on constitutional protections. Many lawmakers have expressed concern that the directive may be paving the way for federal overreach, with defense intelligence components potentially being used to monitor and suppress civilian activities without adequate oversight. The potential impact of this directive is wide-reaching, especially when considering its authorization of military and intelligence components working alongside local law enforcement during periods of civil unrest.
Our role in Congress and on this committee in cutting bureaucracy at the Pentagon, our role in safeguarding the American taxpayer investment in the United States military. Why would we fund this position?
This collaboration raises concerns about the blurring of lines between military and civilian law enforcement, which has long been a sensitive issue in the U.S. The prospect of military intelligence assisting in domestic law enforcement efforts could infringe on the Posse Comitatus Act, which limits the federal government's ability to use the military for law enforcement purposes. Critics argue that this directive might create loopholes that allow federal agencies to bypass these legal safeguards. As Congress prepares to return to session, many lawmakers are determined to address these issues head-on. They seek to clarify the directive's intentions and ensure that any actions taken under its authority respect the constitutional rights of American citizens. The urgency surrounding this issue is compounded by concerns about how this directive could be deployed in the aftermath of future elections or civil protests. Key provisions in the DoD. The DoD directive, formerly known as 5240.1, lays out a framework for military intelligence components to support local law enforcement or state agencies in specific situations, particularly emergencies. This directive provides guidance on how defense intelligence units can engage in domestic operations, a sensitive area where civilian rights and military boundaries intersect. Its primary goal is to outline the circumstances under which these intelligence components can be mobilized, especially when there are imminent threats to civilian lives or national security concerns. One of the directive's key provisions is its authorization for military intelligence units to assist local law enforcement in emergency situations. This could occur in cases where local authorities are overwhelmed, such as during riots, civil unrest, or large-scale emergencies that threaten public safety. The directive specifies that military involvement must be justified based on the level of risk, appropriateness, and cost, and different actions will require different levels of approval depending on the circumstances. In more severe cases, where the threat involves the potential for serious harm or demise, the involvement of top federal officials is mandatory. Actions that carry high risks, such as those involving lethality or substantial military resources, may need direct approval from the Secretary of Defense or even the President.
Site of Boeing, it talks about global equity, diversity, and inclusion being a strategic pillar. About a wedge issue, because the sponsor of the amendment wants to create divisions in the military. The military knows that diversity of our soldiers is actually a strength.
Additionally, the directive enforces Executive Orders 12-333 and 13-388, which provide overarching guidelines for intelligence activities. These executive orders set boundaries for how the government conducts intelligence gathering and uses military resources within the United States, but the directive offers more specific applications in relation to defense intelligence components and their cooperation with local authorities. A significant aspect of this directive is its 72-hour urgency clause, which allows intelligence units to be deployed without prior approval in urgent situations. This means that for up to 72 hours, defense intelligence components can assist local law enforcement without the usual authorization from top officials, as long as the situation justifies immediate intervention. After the 72-hour period, however, proper authorization must be obtained for any continued involvement, ensuring some level of oversight once the immediate crisis passes. This clause has raised eyebrows due to the potential for quick military involvement in civilian matters without initial checks, even though it requires later validation. Lethal force and intelligence overreach. The most controversial aspect of the DoD directive centers on Section 3.3, which details the conditions under which lethal force may be authorized. This provision has triggered significant concern due to its implications for how military intelligence components could be used in domestic law enforcement operations. Specifically, Section 3.3 outlines the levels of approval required for lethal force to be deployed in situations where confrontations between law enforcement and civilians are reasonably foreseeable. In practice, this means that if intelligence personnel are assisting local law enforcement during an event where violence is anticipated, such as a protest or civil unrest, they could potentially be involved in situations where the use of lethal force becomes necessary. The directive does not shy away from acknowledging the risks involved, noting that in some cases, such assistance may lead to serious bodily injury or even demise. This has raised alarms over the possibility of military personnel being engaged in lethal confrontations with civilians on U.S. soil, a scenario that could severely damage public trust in law enforcement and government institutions. Critics argue that while the directive sets out a chain of command for approving such measures, the very inclusion of military intelligence in civilian law enforcement raises red flags about the potential for escalation and overreach in already volatile situations. Beyond the lethal force concerns, the directive also provokes anxiety over intelligence gathering without full authorization. The document provides avenues for intelligence components to engage in surveillance and data collection on civilians during urgent situations without obtaining the usual required approvals beforehand. This provision, though temporary, opens the door to broad surveillance activities during times of unrest, such as protests or demonstrations, under the justification of national security.
The culture within the DoD of confounding and even suspicious decisions. The Department of Defense returns to Congress every year and asks for hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars.
The fear here is that these intelligence gathering activities could be used to monitor and potentially suppress civilian movements without proper oversight, infringing on privacy rights and civil liberties. This has raised serious concerns about government overreach, particularly in moments of crisis when emotions and tensions are already high. In the wrong hands, critics warn, these provisions could be misused, leading to widespread surveillance and control over civilian populations under the pretense of maintaining order. Representative Andy Harris's response. During a Newsmax interview with Chris Allo, Representative Andy Harris voiced serious concerns about the implications of the Department of Defense directive. As a Republican from Maryland, Harris has taken a lead role in expressing skepticism and caution regarding the potential overreach of this directive. His primary concern stems from the idea that this policy could, under certain conditions, authorize military action against U.S. citizens. He argued that this might occur under the pretense of a national security emergency, where the government could bypass traditional checks and balances to deploy military forces domestically. Harris framed the directive as particularly troubling in the context of the upcoming elections. He speculated that if election results were to trigger widespread civil unrest, The Biden-Harris administration could use the directive as a tool to declare a national emergency and deploy the military.
We need people who are willing to serve, again, not their own personal interests, but the interests of the community at whole. We should ask ourselves, anything we attempt to do is whether it strengthens the family or it doesn't. Everything.
In such a scenario, the directive could be exploited to justify the use of lethal force or intelligence operations against protesting citizens, all under the rationale of maintaining national security. This hypothetical situation has fueled a growing narrative among Republicans that the directive could be wielded as a political weapon in times of electoral uncertainty, turning military power inward against the population. In addition to Harris's concerns about potential election-related unrest, he criticized the lack of transparency surrounding the directive. In his interview, he highlighted that crucial details about how intelligence will be gathered, utilized, and protected are conspicuously missing. According to Harris, the directive does not specify what kind of intelligence operations would be permitted or what protections would be in place to safeguard civil liberties. This vagueness opens the door to a wide range of interpretations, many of which could lead to misuses of power. Harris understood the need for Congress to investigate whether the directive offers enough safeguards to prevent the misuse of military intelligence against American civilians.
We had a bipartisan group of folks in Congress who came together for the Safer Communities Act, which one can buy a lethal weapon, whether they've been found by a court to be a danger to themselves or others. You just might want to know.
She wants to take away everyone's gun. If you take away guns, you can't do it, because people need the guns for protection.
Look, President Biden is going to be inaugurated within a week. What is to be gained except to divide the nation? The Democrats who are making these accusations, are they taking responsibility for the buildings burned in Minneapolis or in Seattle or Portland? Anyone who believes that there are any Republicans or the president who thinks that was a good idea, I don't know where they're getting their ideas from.
Looking ahead, Harris vowed that when Congress reconvenes, lawmakers would launch a thorough review of the directive. He called for close scrutiny of how it was developed and its intended purpose. Harris expressed particular concern about the potential for Democrats to use the directive for political ends if they were to lose the election. He suggested that they might declare a national security threat in response to unrest and use the directive to justify military intervention. This possibility, according to Harris, demonstrates the urgent need for Congress to provide greater oversight and establish safeguards to prevent any future misuse of the policy. Harris's warnings have ignited discussions on Capitol Hill, amplifying calls for increased accountability and transparency regarding the directive's true scope and application. Many Republicans are expected to join him in pressing for answers when Congress resumes. That's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.